We'll go ahead and reconvene the meeting, and it's 10:16, so this time, welcome Raquel. Go ahead and have the legislative update, if you would, please.
Okay. Good morning. For the record, Raquel Rancière, Senior Policy Coordinator with the Oregon Water Resources Department. Today I'm going to be providing you with an overview of the legislative session to date, and I'll touch on some of the bills that are moving through the process that relate to water, and then I'll touch on dead bills, just a few of them, and that's only really those ones that we didn't talk about the last time we met, but given the number of bills and wanting to make efficient use of our time, if I tried to go through every single bill, we would be here for a while. So if there's ones on here that you're curious about that I don't mention, or if there's ones that you recall being mentioned at the last legislative update, feel free to ask, and I can follow up with you as to what has happened with that bill. So on the screen here today, you may wonder why I have Senator Bentz on the screen, and that is because he carried House Bill 2085, which was our dam safety bill on the Senate floor. So this was, if you look closely at the screen, this was when he was carrying our bill on the floor. And then on the right hand of the screen, you'll see that all the votes were green, which basically means that that was a unanimous vote on the Senate floor. So this bill has made its way through the process and has gone back to the House for concurrence, and that one was almost unanimous with just one no vote on the concurrence. So we'll go more into just a refresher on what that bill does, but this one was a pretty significant lift for us this session, and I think it's a very important piece of legislation, so that's why I thought I would highlight it on the introductory slide. Before I move on here, I also want to just briefly recognize staff. So we had a whole team of managers and a few staff from the Administrative Services Division that would meet regularly to help us sort through legislation and fiscals. And so there was a tremendous amount of effort by a number of staff in the agency, so I want to recognize them for that effort. I also want to recognize Stephanie Preibel, who's, you've all met her, and she's been helping me out with the legislative process this session, and it has been a tremendous help. So it also means that I don't know the details of every bill as well as I used to, which is great. So I want to thank her for that, and we'll walk through this now. So the legislative timelines. We are past second chamber. So that was back on May 24th, so that was the second chamber deadline for bills to make it out of policy committees. That means if they're still in a policy committee that they're dead. And June 30th is the constitutional sine die, so that's when they have to be out of there. I won't make guesses. I suspect, though, that we still have quite a bit of ways to go. They can certainly get out early, but there's a number of bills that still must go through the process in order for them to finish up their work. So we'll see what happens, but we do know that June 30th will be the final day. As a reminder, if as we go through this process, if you wanted to look at either testimony or a bill itself, all of that information is on the Oregon Legislature's website. It's very easy to use. So if you have questions about how to use that, feel free to contact me and we can help you sort through that. But there's definitely a lot of information, including you can watch the hearings, you can watch the floor sessions. They're all in video on their website. A few updates on the Water Resources Department's legislation. House Bill 2084, extending place-based planning. This bill is awaiting a vote on the Senate floor. I expect that it will move at some point next week. We also have House Bill 2085, which I talked briefly about, and I'll give you a few more updates on that bill as a refresher of what that bill does here shortly. And then Senate Bill 51, this was our bill that died on first chamber deadline relating to the transfers of the type of use of stored water. We talked briefly about this one yesterday. We've talked about it several times in prior commission meetings. Essentially, it would give us the authority to change the storage rights. So remember, when you build a reservoir, you have a storage right, and then you have secondary water rights to use that water from that storage right, and it's the storage right that we do not believe we have authority to make changes to. This one did die in committee, and there was another one introduced, which I'll cover shortly on future slides. We also have House Bill 5043, which is our budget bill, and then there's also House Bill 5030, that's the statewide bonding bill. That one has yet to move. So the bonding bill is one of those bills that I noted is usually one of the last ones to move and has not yet moved. So hence we know that we're not quite close yet to that deadline for sine die. A little refresher on dam safety. So House Bill 2085, as you recall, had a number of modernization pieces to it for our dam safety statutes. And as a result of that, we did have a very long bill, which in the middle of session, we did end up negotiating with an owner of a dam who had some concerns and had several changes to the bill. We worked very hard to meet her needs while also maintaining what we needed to get out of the bill. So I am happy to report that these bullets are basically the same. So in terms of the big policies that we were trying to address through this bill, those are still in there. And so that includes really clarifying our authorities over, that our jurisdiction is over non-federally regulated dams, as well as that we regulate water and wastewater structures. It also includes that we approve modifications of dams. So this is when you raise the height of the dam or you make some other major modification to the structure, that we would approve those, and then that we also get receipt of final engineering documentation. It also includes a fee for reviews of construction plans. So we don't currently have a fee today for that, and we were able to get that one through as well. And that one's only for new structures as well as if you are raising the height of the dam. In addition, it also includes guidance in the statutes on what the owner's responsibilities are, their responsibility to maintain the dam, as well as to take action if the dam is at risk of failure, essentially. And then it also includes a process in there for safe removal of dams. And this is really specific to high and significant hazard dams. Today, we don't have any process or authority over removals from a safety standpoint. And this is a good time for me to note that this whole modernization effort was really focused on safety. And then this is where I think really the real important parts of this bill is included, which is tools for us to address the maintenance and safety issues with dams. And so as you can see in that second bullet there, there's quite a few different tools that we do not have today that this legislation puts in place, which includes there's no civil penalties associated with the dam safety program, which means we ask people to please address the issues at the dam until such point as it's unsafe, and then we can take action. So, and of course, that means it's a much more expensive repair at that point, and there's a much more public safety risk at that point. So this allows us to address those maintenance issues before they become bigger issues. And again, that's on high and significant hazard dams. It also gives us the authority to get an injunction. So today, we don't have injunction authority associated with the dam safety program. So what that means is if someone's violating an order to address an unsafe dam, because remember that's all we have authority for today, that we can't go to a court to get that injunction. In addition, it also means that if a dam is already unsafe, that we wouldn't be able to get an injunction for that as well. So this puts those kinds of provisions into place, and then it also allows us to work with owners on seismic issues as opposed to having to go to enforcement, which we think is the best approach for us to take at this point in time. Although if there's no action taken, then we can go through that more formal enforcement process. So there's some fairly significant changes there that I think will help us to continue to improve the safety of dams in the state. Moving on to the next bullet there, you can see that it clarifies our general authorities. And so this is really on the department side as to what we can do, and also actions that we can take during a dam failure. And then finally, because this is a significant lift for us, the operative date is not until July 1st, 2020, in anticipation that we'll need to do rulemaking. So House Bill 5043 is the Water Resources Department's budget. This bill is almost through the process as well. And it is awaiting a vote on it will be awaiting a vote on the Senate floor once it goes back to Ways and Means and then goes back to the Senate floor. So it did get a vote in the House, and there was only one no vote, so I think it'll hopefully just make it through the process then with such a good vote on the House. Included in this is a budget note. So this budget note does require the department to report by January on the contested cases and litigation that the department has. And it requires us to provide the ORS and OAR citations, and then the reason for the statute or rule, and some more details around these cases. So that will be something that we will be working on fairly quickly here when session wraps up, because it will be a big undertaking for us to put together. In addition, they also modified our key performance measures. So I heard the discussion about this just a few minutes ago. And so the legislature is the one that sets the key performance measures. They're the KPMs. The legislature outlines the process for those. They set the targets. They set what they are. And so we did get a couple changes to those. I won't go into detail in terms of the targets. We can include that in a future update. But a couple things I would note out of this one is that they did delete 2 of the KPMs. One of them is the one, if you recall, that basically takes the number of points of diversion in the state and then divides that by the number of field staff to determine how many points of diversion per field staff. That one was deleted at the recommendation of the Legislative Fiscal Office. And the second one that was deleted was one we had recommended, which was the number of data sets available on our website. We were close to getting all the ones that were on the list on our website. We only had one more data set left, and so they recommended deletion of that one as well. There's another one that we have noted in previous reports that we found problematic in terms of how it was calculated. It's KPM number 2. And so the legislature did, in the Legislative Fiscal Office, did approve modifying that KPM so that we could calculate it in a manner that makes sense, essentially. And that one, what they changed it to, this is the one that relates to the protection of in-stream water rights, and it's the ratio of regulatory orders issued to protect the senior in-stream water rights to all regulatory orders issued to protect senior water rights. So this KPM, it was changed just slightly so that we're comparing apples to apples as opposed to the previous way it was calculated, which was not. So that one we think is a good change from the standpoint of now it's clear in terms of how it will be calculated, and it'll be a more meaningful measure for us. In addition, the budget bill did include funding, additional funding for the agency. It did not include any reductions, but it did include partial funding of a couple of our, or the first two policy option packages you can see on the screen there. So policy option package 102, it included funding of 6 positions, as well as cost share dollars and observation well dollars for conducting groundwater studies. So that will help us to be able to do an additional groundwater study on top of what we're already doing in the Harney Basin. The other one is POP 101, which includes $550,000 for place-based planning. You all talked about that one, I think, earlier. As you'll note, originally what the department had proposed was $750,000, and so the legislature cut that down to $550,000. In addition, it does include continuing the limited duration planning position. The final one that was approved within our budget bill is POP 112, and that was the one that essentially it makes permanent the position that is the payroll shared services position. So a couple of things I'll note before we move on from the budget is that this all can change from the standpoint of the legislature does typically have an end of session budget bill, so they could make changes to any agency's budget within that bill. They could fund additional packages, for example. So that's something that we'll report on at the next commission meeting as to what the final budget was. In addition, I'll also note that the way that the legislative process works, remember, 5483 is the department's budget bill. There's a separate bill that addresses the lottery bond funding. So what you don't see in this is POP 107, which is the water project grants and loans funding. And I think it was POP 107, maybe it was POP 106, but and that one is the one that's in House Bill 5030 that we're waiting them to take action on. So we don't yet know the outcome of that one, but that's in a different bill. Okay, now I'm going to move on to other legislation. So this is legislation that was not introduced by the department, and I thought I would just touch on ones at a high level. Again, just to give you some sense of the types of legislation that's being introduced related to water.
Raquel, could I ask one question? Going back to the dam safety, as I was thinking about that, was there any additional funding to help that, or do you feel like you was adequately, I mean, Keith Mills, is, him and one other guy does all the dam safety work, right? Is this new bill gonna mandate more workload for them, or is, I mean, a new bill usually implies that there's going to be new responsibilities. I'm just wondering, do we have the staff to implement that bill, or was there any extra funds that came along with that?
Chair Corn and Commissioners, that's a great question. So as part of any bill, we do a fiscal impact statement, and we did not include additional resources to implement that legislation. And that's in part because we're already doing a lot of this work. So it's not, and when I say we're already doing a lot of this work, we're already doing inspections on the dams, we're already trying to figure out how to address the issues on them. This is more about the tools in the toolkit. So, you know, the please letters versus the, okay, we've tried to work with you and now we need to see action. So from that standpoint, we don't see this bill as increasing workloads. So that is why we did not have a fiscal impact on this particular bill, aside from the revenues that come in from the fee. What I will say, though, is that I think we do need to have further conversations about the dam safety program and some of the needs in there, particularly around, so we had policy option package 104, which, as you'll note, was not funded here. And that one would have provided funding for doing seismic seismic assessments or analyses, and we need to do more of that work. We need to do work on inundation analyses. So those are things that are not mandated in the bill that we passed. Those are things that are currently on our needs list and will continue to be on the needs list, among other things. So certainly, we do have some challenges from staffing and resources on that front, but we did not see that this bill creating an increase in workload with the provisions that it contains. Okay, so moving on to other legislation. So House Bill 2856, this was, I think, one that I mentioned the last time. It would have provided $9 million for groundwater studies. And so this, I should say, this whole list of bills was in Joint Ways and Means when we prepared this presentation. I know at least one of them has moved out, although I do think most of them are still in Ways and Means. So I'll note that one when we get to it. But, so this one is in Ways and Means, and it would have provided $9 million. For reference, our package, I think, was around more like $1.something million when it made it out of committee. So smaller scale in terms of what was funded than what was proposed in this bill. House Bill 2331, this bill would have limited the time the department has to enforce well construction standards to 3 years unless there was material misrepresentation. And then it did establish a task force that would have worked on some of the well construction policy issues. And then there was also some discussion of amendments in the Ways and Means Committee that would have provided potentially funding for well log reviews. So this bill is still in the Ways and Means Committee today. House Bill 2672, this bill would reimburse the department for cannabis-related expenses. So this bill was for several agencies. It would allow the department to go to the Department of Revenue to request reimbursement for some of those enforcements. House Bill 3132. This bill we've seen different iterations of this bill in prior legislative sessions. In prior legislative sessions, they were calling them artificial beaver dams, or in prior rulemaking, it was beaver dam analogs. So this bill today is now called restoration weirs. So that's we talked a little bit about this yesterday on the tour when we were looking at a real beaver dam. But this one, they're seeking to mimic some of those outcomes from beavers, but using artificial restoration weirs. This bill proposes that this program be run through the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, so we've been monitoring it from the aspect of the water rights side of things and whether or not they're needed. House Bill 3182, this one is a bill that would have allowed for the on-site treatment of water to be reused on site. So DEQ has some authority on this already, but this one I think is kind of at a smaller scale. So if you think of buildings within Portland, for example, where they would want to reuse this on site, we followed this bill because it would then tie into our exempt uses under reclaimed water. And so we've been just following it from that standpoint and working with the proponents to make sure that the water right provisions are correct, in addition to making sure those exemptions are properly outlined. House Bill 2020, I'm not going to talk too much about today. That bill has changed so many times. This is the big climate legislation. There were over 100 amendments on the bill, of which I've read only the ones that have passed at a high level. And that's in part because is not directly addressing issues that the department would work on. However, it does include, at least the last time I looked at it, I don't know that it's been amended to be otherwise, some provisions that would allow for funding of essentially working lands as well as the water efficiency projects and then in-stream. So there's a nexus there from the standpoint of it could provide some funding that would be able to be used to invest in addressing some water issues, although there's many other items they could fund, so, but that has been on the list in that bill. And House Bill 2377, this one is, again, it has two funding provisions in it. The first one is a sediment study of the lower Rogue River. And then the other one is the reason I'd actually put this one up here. And this one is, it provides funding for the reimbursement of increased pumping costs in the Umatilla Basin. And so they would like to try to move people off of groundwater onto surface water, but surface water from the Columbia costs more to pump, essentially. So this bill would have provided funding to Umatilla County, and it was $1 million for this reimbursement. So this provision was formally included in another bill that we talked about earlier in session that was in different iterations called the Basalt Bank. So this is the Northeast Oregon Water Association that has been talking about this, and or basalt stabilization effort for reference. So by the end of session, though, or to date, it's been included now as just a funding provision as opposed to an establishment of a broader program. More legislation in Ways and Means. By the way, there was a lot of legislation that went to Ways and Means this year. So this list is, that's why this list is so long. House Bill 2536 and 2735 have some similarities, and really it would include the department in a task force and many other agencies to look at staging areas around emergencies. So that's what those two are. One seeks to implement it, and then the other one has this task force associated with it. House Bill 2860, this one is really more applicable to the Oregon Health Authority's programs, but I do highlight it here because this would require testing, landlords to test their wells if they have rental housing. And so it puts some standards for that in place, establishes a grant program related to this, as well as education around the water contaminants that can be in wells. And then it also, this grant program, and this is the part why I really highlight this, is would allow for them to repair these wells. So the instances where you have E. coli, for example, that can be a well construction issue. And so we worked several years ago, this bill's been around a couple times, and they've continued to include that where it could fund repair of wells. So there's quite a bit in this bill, but that's the part that I really wanted to highlight for this group today. House Bill 3081, this one would provide, as it was amended, $30,000 to Klamath County to install stream gauges in the Klamath Basin. This bill came about in part because of some of the concerns that I think this commission has heard about surface water data in the Klamath Basin and I think the Wood River. House Bill 3326, this one has been pared down to a funding bill, and it would provide funding to DEQ for some of the lab testing around algal blooms, and then funding to OHA for recreational harmful algal bloom position. So Again, I think almost all of those bills are still in Ways and Means, with the exception of House Bill 2020, which did move out, and that's the climate bill. So moving into the next committee that's still open, where there's quite a few bills, there's Senate Bill 511. This bill moved out of House Energy, or Senate Environment and Natural Resources, as did Senate Bill 894, and they moved these to the Rules Committee. One would provide funding to Harney County for groundwater-related studies and water conservation measures in the amount of $5 million, and then Senate Bill 894 would have provided funding in the amount of $44 million for the City of Newport dams that we've talked about a couple times here in the past. Senate Bill 946, this is the other transfers of stored water bill that I noted. This one did move out of the committee, but it did go to Rules. And I think I haven't heard any discussions about moving it this session, so I suspect where we'll be at when session closes is this is going to be an interim issue that will need to be worked on and that we'll be trying to move forward with hopefully consensus on. HCR 33, this one, so House Concurrent Resolution 33, that's a little different than most of the other bills up here. This one would have urged essentially a process to create a comprehensive state water vision. And so this one is still in the Rules Committee, and it has not yet moved out of that committee.
Isn't that really kind of redundant to our integrated water resource plan that we already have in place?
Chair Korn, I think it was intended to be complementary, and I think it's an outgrowth of some of the efforts that that many state agencies and stakeholders and the governor's office and legislators have been talking about. So I think that there will be more work in that direction in the future. But that bill was certainly an effort that I think was intended to be complementary. Okay, and then this kind of includes a mix mash of bills in different stages. So SCR 1, so Senate Concurrent Resolution 1, this one would support, or urges support, I guess, of the development of closed-loop pump storage projects. So that one has made it through both chambers but was actually introduced by both chambers separately, and then the Senate version is the one that ended up moving. So I think there's an increase in these type of pump storage projects. So I thought I'd mention that one. There's also several bills this session related to professional licensing, which we're tracking because we license well constructors. And so a couple of them are related to spouses in the armed forces and them being able to get licensing in other states while their spouse is, stationed in that state. They're temporary in nature. There's a couple ones around studying immigrants and refugees and how they get licensed, and then implementing provisions to reduce barriers. There's another one around different forms of identification that can be provided instead of social security numbers, and another one around Eastern Oregon economic border region and licensing there. So quite a few different ones. So we've been tracking those as they, particularly around the well drillers. I'll also note at just a very high level that housing, which ties into land use here, housing has been a very big issue this session. So there's a lot of bills related to that that we've been at least monitoring. Now I'm going to move into two of the bills that I have not mentioned to you yet. So these two had not yet been introduced when we last met, but were introduced in between that time and now. and they're also dead. So, but I'll note them at least so you know that they were introduced. The first one is House Bill 3430. This one was introduced, I think at the request of the Klamath tribes, and this relates to the department's automatic stay provisions that are in statute. So I know there's been conversations about this here at the commission level in the past, and so this would have removed that automatic stay when there's a petition for judicial review of orders of the department and commission. As you'll see on the next slide, it did get at least an informational interview, but there was no hearing on it because it was introduced fairly late in session, and then it was sent to a policy committee where it died. House Bill 3438. This is another bill that was introduced fairly late in session, and it relates to an issue that we've talked about before. There's been bills on before. There was actually another bill this session on it that was broader, but this relates to the grandfathering of a pond in the Butte Creek watershed. This is a pond that is owned by the Careys, and so this would have grandfathered just that pond that does not currently have a water rate. And then there's a bunch of other statewide bills so that we are tracking. So those are around like public records, human resources, fiscal, all the way down the line. There's a lot of those to the point where I'm not going to bother mentioning them today. We'll get the final list of what's passed, and then we'll make sure to distribute that out. And finally, I thought I'd just note here that we have done a number of informational hearings this session. We did an informational hearing on dam safety as part of our bill, but these are the ones that were actually requested that we do. So one was at the request of the city of Newport. They provided an overview of the challenges they have with their dams and their seismic issues and trying to find funding for that. And the committee asked that we provide an overview, a broader overview of some of the challenges in the dams in the state that are poor and unsatisfactory condition, and also on seismic issues as well. We also did an informational hearing on the automatic stays. That's one I mentioned in the prior slide, which came out of that bill that died in committee. There's also, Doug actually did, Doug Woodcock, our deputy director, was part of a panel that talked about the Willamette Reservoir reallocation study and where that effort's at. And then finally, at the request of the chairs in the Joint Ways and Means Subcommittee on Natural Resources, they requested a presentation on the history around the water rate management fee that was introduced in prior sessions. And so Director Byler gave that presentation to that committee as well. So I just thought I would provide that to all of you so you could see some of the topics that were of interest to the legislature outside of just the bills. So I think as you can see here, there's been, from my standpoint, certainly an increased interest in water, a lot of conversations and excitement, I think, around water. And there's also, I think, a number of items that were left unaddressed this session that will require interim work. The one that I can certainly say will require interim work is the transfers of stored water issue. So that one, I'm sure, will be on our work list. So with that, if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them.
Thank you, Raquel.
So, Raquel, you touched on it 3 times, and I'm trying to formulate a question. I think all I want is a little bit more information, perhaps. You mentioned the transfer of type of stored water, and that was dead, and then later you mentioned the Senate Bill 946, transfers of stored water, and I wasn't sure if that was dead. And I'm wondering if you could just help me better understand what the issues remain about those are, and what we're going to have to do to continue to address those. And struck a little bit with the continued work coming out of that, and Mr. Byler's or Director Byler's discussion of our already enviable or unenviable workload.
Chair Korn, Commissioner Baumgartner, I think the So you'll recall last year, during the short session, there was a bill that was introduced that would have addressed the transfers of stored water issue. And it was introduced in the short session. It was a result of the department denying a proposal to transfer the stored water rate. And as a result of that, there was a work group that was convened by Senator Dembro that attempted to find a solution to the issue. And in the meantime, you may recall, we introduced a bill because the only piece that we knew everybody agreed on was that we needed to have authority to do changes to the type of stored water. So the character of use is what some folks talk about. But there's also a desire and a need for being able to do other types of changes, such as changing the location or changing the point of diversion. And that's where there is not consensus on how to move forward. So there was not consensus reached before session started. Senator Dembro scheduled our bill, so Chair Dembro of the Senate Committee on Environment and Natural Resources scheduled our bill for the first week of session, I think it was. It was very early, maybe it was the second week, but so there was hearing on that bill, and I think then some stakeholders tried to work on a proposal. Because remember, our bill only introduced a portion of the issue, right?
Right.
And so through that, there was, and then two legislators also introduced bills. There were kind of placeholders for the discussions or different ways to fix the issue, of which Senate Bill 946, the one I mentioned, was the one that was then the vehicle that was used and amended. But then it did pass out of committee, but it passed out on a party line vote, is my recollection. I've long buried this, so I'm pulling this out of my memory now, is it did pass out on a party line vote, and then it got to the floor, and I think it was recognized that there still wasn't, there was still a need for more work on the bill, I guess, because there was a lot of disagreement over it. So then the bill never went actually for a floor vote, and it went to the Senate Rules Committee, and where it still remains. So I think that's, hopefully that gives you a preview of the issues, and I think the key questions are around the location of stored water and allowing for those kinds of changes in the location.
Thank you, that was really helpful.
Any other questions? Okay, if not, thank you for the report today and the update. Your good work. I know it's been a hectic time for all the staff getting through the legislative session, and it seems like it becomes more intense with every session that goes by, whether it's short or long. It's all you can handle at times, isn't it? So thank you for your efforts and everyone else in the department. So if there's no other questions, we'll go ahead and move on to the next agenda item. So this is item H, feasibility study grants. Water conservation reuse storage grant program and funding recommendations from staff. So, Kim? Chair. Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Oh, yes, Commissioner Fott would like to make a statement here before we start into this.
So I'm going to recuse myself from this agenda item, one, because I have a consulting business and consult with a firm that actually does do work for the grants that Oregon Water Resource Department may look at. I don't personally, I stay away from those. But I want to stay away from any perception of a bias. I have no direct bias, but I'm going to step out just so there's no perception of that. So,
thank you, Commissioner. And we will be hearing from staff, and then there will be opportunities to comment after we get to the staff reports, and I'll explain that a little clearer after we get through with our staff reports today. So, thank you. Go ahead. And if you do have a need to comment either on this issue or you just want to comment in general, again, a reminder to fill out the yellow card in the back and get it to Jennifer. So, thank you.
Good morning again, Vice Chair, Corps, and Commissioners. For the record, I'm Kim Fritz-Ogren, the manager of the Water Resources Development Program here with the department. And presenting with me today is Becky Williams, our grant program coordinator. We are going to be presenting the funding recommendations for this cycle of feasibility study grants. It's not working. Just a quick overview of what we'll discuss this morning. We'll walk through the purpose and history of this funding opportunity, dive into the current review cycle, and then present the funding recommendations for your consideration. We're going to talk a little bit more about the purpose and history of the funding opportunity than we normally do because we simply haven't presented funding recommendations for feasibility study grants in a number of years. So we're going to provide some background and context as to why this funding opportunity exists and what it works to accomplish. So most simply put, feasibility study grants are available to provide funding to help evaluate the feasibility of a water conservation, reuse, or storage project. We accept applications generally every fall and then come to you in every spring for a funding decision, just to create that stability and expectation of folks know when they can apply for funding. A feasibility study seeks to answer one of two questions: should we proceed with the proposed project idea, or how should we proceed? And it can look at things such as engineering, geological studies, hydrological, as well as regulatory and financial. So really looking holistically at what would make a project feasible or not. Applicants or grantees are not required to look at all of those things at once. They can really focus in on their specific question, their study goal, because often you want to evaluate the feasibility sort of in phases in order to make sure you're investing those dollars wisely. So along those lines, the value of a feasibility study, you can determine if a project is worth pursuing. It might not be feasible, or it might be too expensive for what you want to do. You could identify that you need additional information before determining to proceed with a project, or begin to prepare for implementation, doing that design work, preliminary design work before moving on. A few other details, because this funding opportunity differs from water project grants and loans, which we most recently came to the Commission with funding recommendations for last November. This funding opportunity is limited to water conservation, reuse, and storage projects. And there's a funding cap of $500,000 per project. And then if an applicant is proposing to do a storage study, certain storage projects that meet certain criteria are required to include a set of analyses in their study, and that the set of analyses depends on whether they're a municipality or not. An example of those analyses is they need to look at environmental harm or impacts, as well as look at different ecological flows that are needed in the stream that the project would divert from. This is the oldest active funding opportunity in the department. The authorizing legislation, Senate Bill 1069, was passed in 2008. Since then, 82 studies have been funded that have looked at either conservation, reuse, and storage, or a combination of those two. So on the slide is a breakdown of what the different studies have looked at, and if you total it all up, it's more than 82, and that's because some projects looked at a combination of conservation and reuse. So those are double counted. We were awarded over $5 million in grants, and it's varied over the biennia, and that's a reflection generally of what funds were authorized by the legislature. So in the 2015 and 2017 legislative sessions, we received an extra amount of funding sort of above what the normal service level was, so we were able to then award a greater number of grants. We last came to you in May of 2017 with funding recommendations, and then we chose to skip a cycle for a few reasons. We had done sort of an extra cycle in the 2015-2017 biennium, And then we had a number of staff changes and were down in capacity and could not manage a funding cycle in addition to doing the other work. So we chose to skip a year. And with that, I will pass it off to Becky, who will walk through the 2018-2019 funding cycle review process.
Great. Good morning. As Kim said, we're going to talk about this particular cycle of the feasibility study grants. This year, we have approximately $2.5 million that are available for award. The applications for this cycle were due in the fall, October 17th. That's a consistent time frame that we like to hold this funding opportunity to facilitate grantees and future applicants to understand their time frame of preparation. This particular cycle, we had 8 complete applications that were received. The study types included 1 below-ground storage study, and 7 were to study conservation or conservation-related aspects. We have here just a list of the 8 complete applications that were received in October. As you can see, the total of requested funds was $810,000 and some change, with the total cost of the studies being about $1.6 million. Now we're going to walk through the application review process. Again, I will just note that this feasibility study grant review process follows a similar steps, but there are some differences between this and the water project grant process. So it's important to note, and I will describe this a little bit more. So applications, as I mentioned, are due in October this particular year. I will note, up until that point in time, interested applicants are free to contact us and engage in pre-application conferences and ask us a variety of questions. After that point in time, there is not an opportunity to change the details of their applications or rescope the focus of their proposed study. So after the applications are received by the department, we do an internal check on their eligibility and completeness and send them off to our application review team. They conduct a review of the applications. We meet, and there's a initial fund or do not fund decision based on the merits of the application. We'll step through that in a couple slides. Then they score those applications that received a fund vote. We have an initial funding recommendation. Then that funding recommendation gets posted online for public comment. Then we come before you to issue and decide on the actual funding.
I'm a little confused as to why you score after you make a fund, do not fund. That seems backwards.
So this particular grant scoring process is not as prescriptive as that is defined in the statute for water project grant and loan. In a future slide, which we'll be getting to, I'll describe the 3 points that the review team discusses, and that would be a trigger for a do not fund vote.
Okay.
Broadly speaking, it's a desire to ensure that only applications that meet those criteria then move forward to scoring.
I see. Okay.
The application review team is made up of representatives from these different state agencies, Business Oregon, our own department, Fish and Wildlife, and DEQ. I will note here that ODA has historically been a participant on the review team, and we anticipate they will again in the future. This particular year, they were facing some capacity constraints, and so opted to pass this particular cycle. Now, getting to the question, after the application review team has an opportunity to individually review and evaluate these proposals, we meet, and they have an opportunity to consult and debate with one another the merits of the applications. Within that process, there is an opportunity to make a fund or do not fund vote. And there are 3 criteria that would warrant a do not fund vote. Is the proposal a feasibility study? There is a potential that some proposal may veer too much into implementation. And so if that was the case, the review team would note that and vote accordingly. Does the application indicate a readiness for funding? The criteria within that are there any missing elements in the proposal, the key tasks, or are they described in insufficient detail to call into question the ability of the applicant to successfully achieve the outcome that they have desired? And then the third question is water available? This is from a regulatory or physical perspective. However, if the question of is water available a part or focus of the study, and it is acknowledged in the application, then the review team gives the benefit of the doubt to the applicant. After that fund, do not fund vote by the review team, projects or studies that receive at least a 50% fund vote move on to scoring. Again, this scoring differs from water projects. It is scored based on the goal of the study, the need for the water, the community benefit or support, collaboration that the community has been involved in, and then the bulk of the scoring resides in the question of technical planning or preparedness. Again, are all the key details included to acknowledge and show substantial preparation to achieve their goal? Then the projects are ranked by score and recommended for funding based on the available funds that we have. At this time, then, Kim will move into discussing those studies that were recommended for funding.
So I will walk through each of the studies that are recommended for funding at a high level, not jumping into a ton of detail. And I'll note that in your staff report, attachment 1 includes some additional detail, a study summary, and then a summary of the application review team's evaluation of the application. And I'll also note that these are presented in alphabetical order. So the first study recommended for funding is a below-ground storage study in Umatilla County that's proposed by the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council that would look at enhancing the reliability of alluvial groundwater supply in that basin. Their study proposes to evaluate 3 alternatives to recharge, and they would look at the technical, political, regulatory, and economic feasibility of each of those 3 alternatives. The second study is the Lundy Ditch Irrigation Efficiency Feasibility Study. It's a conservation study proposed by 2 co-applicants, the Deschutes Soil and Water Conservation District and the Arnold Irrigation District. This would look at piping the Lundy Ditch, which is about 4,000 feet, as well as looking to see if they could consolidate other laterals and implement some on-farm water efficiency projects. They're looking to evaluate both the potential water and energy savings of the project, as well as begin to look at the potential costs. They estimate that currently the Lundy Ditch loses about 42% of the water that passes through it. The third study is proposed by Farmers Conservation Alliance, and it's the Talent Irrigation District Water Conservation Study in Jackson County. They're requesting, and we're recommending funding just under $50,000 to analyze their existing water infrastructure in order to develop a system improvement plan that would look to see what different alternatives they could pursue for modernizing their infrastructure. They would do a series of meetings, some GIS mapping, water loss assessment, and meetings with the district in order to determine which alternatives they would like to pursue. Next, we have the Tower Ditch Sleeving Feasibility Study in Deschutes County. Once again, there are 2 co-applicants, the Deschutes Soil and Water Conservation District and the Swally Irrigation District. They are interested in looking at sleeving or lining a current pipeline. They had previously done an investigation to see if they could replace this pipeline and found it to be cost prohibitive, so they're looking at this alternative to see if it could help them conserve water and then eventually move to having a pressurized irrigation system. The Freshwater Trust has proposed and we recommend funding the Upper John Day Irrigation Water Conservation Feasibility Study in Grant County for just over $150,000. They are interested in doing, at first, a desktop exercise to look at potential water-saving infrastructure. They would then prioritize that list based on a number of items, including costs, the benefit, and landowner interest. Then those projects that rise to the top and landowners are interested in pursuing them, they would do some design work for those projects. And then next, we have Grants Pass Irrigation District's application for water and energy with variable speed drives on the Rogue River study in Josephine County. And what they would like to do is to investigate the feasibility of replacing their current electrical system with a more efficient variable speed drive pump. They had done a similar project on a much smaller scale and have seen some water and energy savings, and so they're interested in broadening that effort, replacing more of their system to see if that would come to a benefit for the district, and they would like to see how much that would cost if that's financially feasible for them. And then the final study that's recommended for funding is the White Ditch Sucker Creek Water Conservation Study, also in Josephine County, as proposed by the Illinois Valley Soil and Water Conservation District. And they would like to investigate options for ditch and on-farm improvements One of the things that they would like to do is to clarify the water rights associated with the ditch. There are some very old water rights, and they don't have good maps and a good understanding of all of what's involved. So they want to make sure they have that straight, and then also look then at what infrastructure improvements they could do to conserve water. And in addition to that, they would like to do some preliminary design work on the preferred alternative that they identify. And with that, Becky will now talk about the studies not recommended for funding at this time.
Thanks. This particular funding cycle, there was one application that was not recommended for funding by the application review team and received a do not fund vote. The application was submitted by the City of Umatilla. It is for a conservation study type for just over $300,000. Excuse me. They have proposed to investigate the potential of using less water by evaluating the feasibility of accessing a better quality of water through the hydraulic connection of groundwater to surface water. To do that, they have proposed to drill some exploratory boreholes and a test well to test and monitor the water to determine the hydraulic connection, as well as the ability of the water quality to be more conducive to lowering their demand of water. As the review team discussed this application, they did not believe that the application as written contained all the tasks needed to show the technical preparedness and readiness of the proposal. Specifically, during the discussion, they identified that a key detail was missing, that the application did not acknowledge or discuss the presence of a development limitation on their water right, where an updated water management and conservation plan was required and able to lift that development limitation. They also did not believe that the application identified the need for a permit amendment to address the well location. I will note that the city has since clarified that they have indeed addressed that issue in their application.
Was this identified after the deadline?
Yes. But however, the application did note the permit amendment in the second bullet.
Yeah, the application review team didn't see that in the application in their review, but during the public comment period, the city pointed to the page of the application where they made that reference. And so, while we wanted to acknowledge that point from the ART because it's included in your materials, but it's not actually an issue with the application. It's been clarified.
As the review team discussed this application, they also noted that the study goal and the potential economic opportunity for the city was really viewed quite favorably. The proposal represented an interesting and innovative concept, and that they recommended that the application be revised to be comprehensive and thorough in addressing the development limitations specifically, and resubmitted for a future funding cycle. The funding recommendations after scoring and evaluation and ranking were then posted online for a 30-day public comment period. During that comment period, the department received comments in support of the Talent Irrigation District Water Conservation Study and the White Ditch Sucker Creek Water Conservation Study. The department also received comments from the City of Umatilla in response to the application review team's evaluation and requested that the commission reconsider the application and award funding. Representatives of the city are here today, so I won't go into the comments in greater detail as they will later represent their position. Also, and additionally, the department notified the affected tribes in the areas of these potential studies and notified of the funding recommendations and provided an opportunity for comment. We received comments from the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation expressing concern of the proposed study from the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council on enhancing the reliability of the alluvial groundwater supply. In that comment letter, they expressed both concern and requested study modifications. After voting and scoring, as I mentioned, these are the funding recommendations provided by the application review team. Of the listed studies here, we have a recommendation for funding totaling just under $450,000 in grant funds. Therefore, the following alternatives are before the commission today. And these are, number one, to adopt the staff funding recommendations contained in Table 1, Section 4 of this report. Option 2, to adopt a modified funding recommendation. And 3, you may direct the department to further evaluate the applications and return with a revised proposal. The department recommends that the commission authorize alternative 1 to adopt the staff funding recommendations contained in Table 1, Section 4 of this report. And this is a recap of that funding recommendation that the application review team and the department is forwarding for consideration by the commission.
Thank you very much for your report and the information you've given. Just a few things I wanted to cover here. First of all, as a commission, we're going to consider this a little bit modified of what's been presented for us, and we are going to take public comments before we vote on these grants, and I think we have a couple, Jennifer, but I want to explain a little bit what we're going to do here. Commissioner Quimps, would you comment on some conflicts that you have and the reason, and then I'll follow up on the reason of why we're going to divide this up the way we are.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I don't have a conflict of interest, but I want to avoid the appearance of a conflict of interest, so I want to recuse myself from the deliberation and the vote on the Walla Walla Basin study.
Okay. Thank you, Commissioner Quimps. So what we're going to do is we're going to consider all the proposals except for the Walla Walla study and then also the City of Umatilla. We will just, so the public comment, we'll go ahead and start with if there's anybody here from any of the other 6 potential grantees that we're going to give grants to that would like to comment. I'll take those comments now, and I don't believe, I don't have any in my hand. Is there anybody else here from the Lundy Ditch or the Talent Irrigation, Tower Ditch, Steering, John Day Irrigation, Water Conservation, Water Energy and Conservation, for the Rogue River or the White Ditch Sucker Creek Water Project? Is there anyone here that would like to comment on those 6 potential grants? Okay. If not, does any of the commissioners have any questions of staff concerning those 6 grants at this point that you would like to have answered before we move forward with a potential motion to approve those 6 grants? Okay, seeing none, then I would entertain a motion to approve those 6 grants if the commission feels so inclined.
Want me to make motion?
If you would like. Or any other commissioner.
I move that the commission adopt the staff funding recommendations contained in Table 1, Section 4 of this report for all the grants listed except the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council and the City of Umatilla grant applications, which to be considered in a separate motion. This motion would result in 6 grant applications being funded totaling $369,059.
Thank you, Commissioner Baumgartner. We have a motion on the floor. Is there a second?
I second that motion.
Thank you, Commissioner Carrara. It's been moved and seconded that we approve the motion as read by Commissioner Baumgartner. Do you need it read again, or is everybody comfortable with what was just stated? Okay, any further discussion or questions? If not, we'll go ahead and vote the motion by roll call, starting with Commissioner Mull.
Yes.
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 Thank you. Motion passes unanimously. So at this time, then, Commissioner Quemps will be...
Commissioner Corn, if, for the record, it would be good to identify the individuals as we do the roll call. Would it be okay for us to go through that just one more time?
Okay. So you can write them down, or
So we have
state them as they vote?
Yeah, so that they know how each person...
Commissioner Mull, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Carrara?
Yes.
Commissioner Quemps?
Yes.
Commissioner Baumgartner?
Yes.
And I'm Commissioner Corn, I vote yes.
Thank you.
Is that enough?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so now we'll go ahead and move into the other 2 for consideration. We do have 2 public comments. Remember that Commissioner Quemps has recused himself. I think you can stay here. He will not be commenting, asking questions, or voting on this motion for this reason. Therefore, it requires a vote of all 4 of us commissioners unanimously for this to be approved, because we are getting down to as narrow as we can get on a quorum for this consideration. So at this time, I think we'll go ahead and...
Commissioner, sorry to interrupt. May I ask one question before we...
Sure, of course, that's what
Just
we're
for
here for.
clarity, can we go back to the slide that has the process, the overview from October submission on? And I'm sorry if I lost track of this, but I want to understand the timing. So grants applications were submitted mid-October. Can you walk me through rough months associated with each of those subsequent steps, please?
Certainly. The applications are due in October. Immediately thereafter, we do an initial eligibility and completeness review of those applications. We notify applicants then that whether or not their application will proceed. The complete applications then are dispersed to the application review team. They have a couple months to review those applications. We, I believe, met in the end of January for this particular funding cycle. During that meeting is when the review team consults and debates together. Then in the meeting, they take the fund and do not fund vote, and then typically are allowed 2 weeks to submit their scores. That is when we use the scoring results and the available funding to determine which grants are funded. In this particular case, we had available funds to fund all the recommended grant applications. Then that 30-day public comment period is, I believe, ran from completed on April 15th. And then traditionally, we might have a commission meeting in May. It seems that this year was a little bit later, so.
So within that time frame, then, there's no additional interaction with the applicants?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Any further, thank you.
No further questions. Thank you.
Any further questions from any of the other commissioners? Okay, if not, then we have for public comment, and I hope I pronounced your first name right, Tamaya J. Mabut from the city of Umatilla. I invite you to come forward and state your name, please, for the record.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's Tamara Mabut, City of Umatilla. Close, that's all right.
I'm sorry. The I look like an I.
That's all right. Bad penmanship. And if you might, I'd have my colleague Scott Coleman, our Public Works Director, we can present together.
Yeah, I see I have a comment, so if you want to do it together, or however you want to do it, that's fine.
Terrific. Okay, and Mr. Chair, I think your staff assistant gave you 3 different documents. One is a copy of my testimony with attachments, and one is a copy of Mr. Coleman's testimony, also with one attachment, and then also a letter from Senator Hansel, who just sent me a text, and he's tied up in Ways and Means and is not able to make it, but his letter is in support of our application. And Senator Hansel represents the city of Umatilla and Northeast Oregon. So my name is Tamara Mabut, and I am the Community Development Director for the city of Umatilla, a town of about 8,000 residents. And I say about because it varies depending on the inmate population at Two Rivers Correctional Institute. And by the way, they are our largest water user in the city of Umatilla. Prior to working for the city, I spent 27 years as a county planner, 15 years as the Umatilla County Planning Director, during which time I oversaw the development of the Umatilla 2050 Water Plan. I have a longstanding record of connecting water and land use issues in both the regulatory setting as well as in long-range planning and policy. This is in large part where I changed career and now work for a small city that has the potential and commitment to lead the way in innovative water development. So I've been there for 18 months now. And thank you again for accepting our testimony. First, I want to acknowledge the professional staff involved in the review of the feasibility grants. The city very much respects their knowledge and expertise. They have indeed been very helpful in this process. That being said, we would like to make an unusual request and ask for your reconsideration of the committee recommendation. This request would include the inclusion of the application timely filed, to Mr. Chair Korn's note, for the city of Umatilla. Your agency is in a unique position with this grant program in that there are sufficient funds to include our application as well as the other applications recommended for approval. Again, while we respect your staff and your professionalism, we disagree with their conclusion that the city application did not adequately address the need to update our water management and conservation plan. A review of the technical matters were included in a letter to Rebecca Williams and is part of your meeting packet, and she noted those as well. The city grant application did acknowledge the need to file an updated water management conservation plan prior to disbursement of grant funds, and we have in fact filed an updated plan. We acknowledge that happened recently, this week in fact, but we were advised that city application would be accepted by the grant committee, and it was without an updated water management conservation plan, and city staff relied on the guidance of staff in that matter, which we have documented. In 2016, OWRD awarded the city a $130,000 grant for a beneficial reuse feasibility analysis, our so-called BRFA. The city matched those funds dollar for dollar, and the BRFA was completed in fall of 2018, just a few months prior to submitting the subject feasibility grant application. One of the principal BRFA recommendations was that the city conduct well tests to demonstrate hydraulic connectivity to the Columbia River. This is a necessary first step in developing the city's 23 CFS Columbia River water right. And so that was precisely the purpose of our feasibility grant application, to demonstrate hydraulic connectivity. The project described in the application is sound. It is important not only to the city, but to the larger Umatilla Basin. The city is located in the North Butter Creek Critical Groundwater Area, and I note the map of the critical groundwater areas in our region is attached to your packet. We're at the very top of that. And is the only water right holder permitted to use an allocation. The city competes directly with many farmers in our region. If city was able to develop our surface water right, many farmers could use water from the critical aquifer, and/or demand on the water aquifer could be reduced, allowing it a long overdue opportunity to recharge. The department and commission understand the critical groundwater area very well. It was a topic of your May 2018 meeting. Additionally, the aquifer has water quality challenges and is part of the Lower Umatilla Basin Groundwater Management Area, and a map of that area, which is rather vast, is also included in your packet, and it was given that designation in 1991 by the EPA and your counterparts at Oregon DEQ because of very high nitrate content in the water. So why is the city so persistent about the need to approve our grant request? Well, for two reasons. First, the condition of the groundwater aquifer is not improving. In fact, the city has had to deepen 2 wells in each of the previous years, in 2017 and 2018. So as noted in our water management conservation plan, the city needs to develop an alternative and more reliable long-term water supply. Second, City of Umatilla has a close working relationship with some corporate partners who are willing to help with capital costs to develop our Columbia River water right, should we successfully demonstrate hydraulic connectivity. We believe we can do that, but only with the benefit of your approval of our grant application. The urgency of this we are in the precipice of seeing new development inside the city limits and the urban growth area, and we want to use that opportunity to partner with the private sector to develop our Columbia River water. But we need the study results in hand before we can proceed with a capital-intensive project. This is a win for water and a win for the economy. And next, Scott Coleman will speak. Unless you'd like to ask me any questions, I'd be happy to answer. One last note, that large study that you funded a few years ago, I included a copy of the executive summary in your packet. And again, one of the recommendations is the project we're proposing in our grant application.
Thank you. Any questions?
One question. Is it too early to have an estimate of what capital costs of implementation would be and what percentage those corporate partners will cover?
It will be expensive. One corporate partner is our second largest water user, not the Two Rivers Creek. They currently use about 1 million gallons a day. We don't know exactly, but we do know that if they are allowed to switch to Columbia River water, it will reduce their overall water use and consumption and discharge by 40%. And that's because the groundwater at that particular well has a really high silica content, so they run the water through a reverse osmosis system. And so they sort of waste 40% of their water through that process. So to directly answer your question about the capital costs, Scott might have a better idea.
From our engineers' standpoint, they're looking at between $5 and $7 million to completely get the city off of the aquifer if the feasibility were to show that we are hydraulically connected. Those are super preliminary costs, and so they're very inflated, in my opinion. So the corporate partners haven't given us a percentage of what they would pay, but they have been very generous up to this date in helping us with a lot of other projects.
Thank you.
So, you bet.
Any further questions? Mr. Coleman, then, if you'd like to make some comments, or go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is Scott Coleman. I'm the Public Works Director of the City of Umatilla. I'd like to tell you a little bit about the city's innovative approach to water management and conservation. The city has historically relied on 4 groundwater wells. As you know, the aquifers are declining. The city's had to deepen 2 wells in the past 2 years. On average, during the year, our city can use upwards of 3.5 million gallons per day. This may seem like a lot to some and minor to others. To put it in terms that anyone can picture, that amount of water would fill 5 Olympic-sized pools daily, or run approximately 4 full-length pivots to irrigate crops 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. Imagine if we could take that burden off the local aquifer that is being tapped on a daily basis in a critical groundwater area. With the water feasibility grant in the city's capital, we could drill test wells near the Columbia River to prove hydraulic conductivity to reduce to the river aquifer. These hydraulically connected wells would allow the city to utilize the natural storage of the Columbia River and the city's 23 cubic feet per second water right and permanently remove the city from the local aquifer. The 2016 beneficial reuse and feasibility analysis, funded in part by OWRD, was intended to look at the long opportunities for the city to provide water to lands within the city and the urban growth area, as well as an unincorporated area between Umatilla and Hermiston. Between the BRFA report was a recommendation to develop an industrial wastewater system to reuse industrial wastewater, which the city is in the process of implementing. Just last week, we opened bids for construction and will begin building, hopefully next month, the $2.5 million industrial wastewater line. The IWW line will pipe industrial wastewater into a Bureau of Reclamation facility. From there, water will be pumped to the nearby irrigation district and used by local farmers. In this first year of operation, the IWW will provide an added benefit of diverting 1 million gallons a day from the city's wastewater treatment plant. That we're currently processing that water through our wastewater treatment plant, and anybody that knows wastewater treatment plants, they don't do good with clean water. So it's a tough situation, and we're working really hard at it, and we are in compliance, by the way. So the city of Umatilla's ultimate goal is to be completely self-sustaining while providing water for the IWW and eventually our wastewater treatment plant. To send any reuse water to growers for their crops and anything that can be used in a beneficial reuse. This would eliminate a need to put any water back in the river system during the irrigation season and be on the forefront of technology and reuse water for beneficial use. I'd be happy to answer any questions. The attachment on the back here that we put in here is of the the IWW lines that we will be now installing over the course of the next 2 years and putting that water for reuse back into the irrigation canal to be used at West Extension Irrigation District. We are in a unique area where we're at, being as close to the Columbia River and as close to a dam site. So therefore, that watershed that's been man-made, we're hoping to improve that conductivity to where we won't have to use any more water out of that aquifer, and we'll be able to pull off of the Columbia River. So that's just the brief of it, and we hope you'll reconsider.
I'm sorry, Bob. Go ahead, we'll go with, so I was looking that way, and then we'll go to your question.
Okay. So perhaps you can help me understand, I'm missing something in the connection between this grant, what you propose to do, and how that relates to your reuse study. And maybe you could walk me through that. And by the way, I commend you on your reuse efforts.
Yeah. The reuse, mainly I stuck the reuse in there to show you what we're currently doing and that we're currently spending our capital to do that based on OWRD's grants in the past. I just kind of threw that in there just to show that there is an end to the means, hopefully, and with the grant that we're applying for now, what was the second part of your question?
I'm wondering about the connection. The second part was just commending you on reuse.
And so part of it was to convince you that the grant you previously awarded us, we're taking it seriously. So we've pursued implementation of the first part, which is the industrial wastewater discharge facility. And this proposal would be to move forward on another one of those recommendations. So not a direct nexus, but just to try to impress you that we're being innovative and good stewards of the water.
Well, I'm easily impressed.
Okay.
After you, Commissioner Mull.
So I'm sorry, this one statement, this final statement, I don't quite understand in the final paragraph and what you just presented. This would eliminate a need to put any water back in the river system during the irrigation season.
Yeah.
I don't understand that.
Well, ultimately, the goal for the city of Umatilla is to reuse all of our water and multiple times. And the ultimate goal would be able to reuse our wastewater treatment plant, get it to to where we can get it back to the farmers as well, and put that back in the irrigation canal. During the irrigation season, obviously, when we're not irrigating, the water has to go someplace, and so the water from our wastewater treatment plant would therefore go into the back to the river system.
So it's putting treated wastewater back into the river?
Correct. Yes, sir. Yes,
Gives
sir.
the impression that a water-limited stream is somehow missing out on water that might help it. It's the way I read it, so
yeah.
I hear what you're saying now. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, I would like to better understand just the process and whether there was an error made that we had some influence in that error. And just to qualify the question a little bit, I am a believer somewhat in process. So when we set up the process, we need to follow the process so that everybody can be treated equitably and fairly, and people don't get to come in later after the process and second guess it. And I'm a little bit loath to be put in a position of second guessing the staff, but nonetheless, here we are. And so my question is, I inferred that there's either a mistake made in an understanding of the permitting requirements and whether they were actually provided in time. And from you, Tamara, I understand, or am led to believe, that you were responding based on your understanding of input from the staff, and therefore we may own some of the processing problems or procedural problems. And I don't know who that goes to, but perhaps somebody can help me out with that.
So, Mr. Chair, if I may, I'll take the first stab at responding. So it's a very fair question. I've been on the other side of the table awarding grants, and I think being fastidious and following the rules and the timelines is very important. And that's why I said in my opening comments, we're in an awkward position to say, would you make an exception and deviate slightly from your staff's recommendation? We think we did meet those technical requirements. As Ms. Williams said, this process is, I don't think you used the word subjective, but it has a little bit more latitude than maybe some of your other grant applications. So fully respect the opinion of your staff. In follow-up comments, the reason you have a 30-day comment is we took the opportunity to say, I think both statutorily and substantively, we did address those, not to the extent and level that I think the grant review committee read. So we did indeed reference the need to update our water management conservation plan, and we also did indeed reference the need to renew our 23 CFS permit. But it's a bit of a catch-22, right? So why would we renew that permit if we don't know how we're going to do that? And you don't renew the permit until you have an updated water management conservation plan, and you have some notion of whether or not technically it's feasible. It's one thing to have it on paper, it's another thing to know how it might work. And I'm a little loath to share this with you, but it's the truth, and I think it's relevant, which is also one of the reasons why Senator Hansel said, oh, that's an important point. So I've been at the city for 18 months. It was sort of a tumultuous time. The city manager left. I was the interim city manager, and we didn't have a public works director for about 3 months. So we farmed out some work, including our grant application. We have to own that because we farmed it out. I think if we had written the grant application internally, we would have done a more thorough job of vetting those issues. So again, I don't think you are being disrespectful or challenging your staff. That's why you have the 30-day review process. So if there are particular issues that possibly weren't fully developed in the application, we clarified those.
Does that answer your question?
Commissioner Corrin, if I may also respond, just to clarify. So there were two reasons in the ART's review that they felt that the application did not demonstrate that the applicant was technically prepared to carry out the study. One of those was they thought that they didn't identify the need for a permit amendment. After receiving the city's letter, Becky and I went back and checked the application just to verify and make sure there wasn't anything missed, and the ART did miss that. So that item, issue of technical preparedness, I'd say is moot. It's not an issue. But what still remains is the acknowledgement of the development limitation and the need to do an updated WMCP. That was not in the study application. As the representatives from the city have said, they have identified that need and have worked to address that issue after the application was submitted.
Yeah, I had a question about the water conservation plan, and you said that was just submitted this week. Was there a due date when that was due prior to considering grants, or, I know it's part of the grant process, but was there not a due date that was just due in the natural scheme of things too?
There was some change to that. And that's long before I got there as well. I went back through all of our paperwork, and our original deadline was in 2020, I believe, and Kim, you can correct me on if I'm wrong on that. But then there was an amendment or something sent back to the city that said that, no, we needed to update it by 2018, August of 2018 sometime, I believe. And that slipped through the cracks. It had not been updated. The only thing I can say is that we probably would have not went through the grant process if we felt like we weren't prepared to do that. We were told that the WMCP, Water Management and Conservation Plan, would not be held against us in the grant awarding process. That we just wouldn't be awarded the funding until the wastewater management conservation plan was updated. So we are in the process of doing that. We would have not even applied for the grant and wasted anybody's time had we known that it would be holding it up. I mean, we would have waited until we had all of our technical stuff completely ready for which they said. But that's, like I said, that's just, that's what we were told, so
Commissioner Corn, I think it would be helpful for me to clarify how water management and conservation plans interact with the two funding opportunities and the differences, and it sort of speaks to what Scott is talking about. So you might recall for water project grants and loans in statute, applicants, if they're required to have a WMCP, must have an approved plan on file before they apply. That is not the case for feasibility study grants. And instead, what the department requires, because we want to be consistent within our different divisions and sections, is that somebody can apply for a feasibility study grant if they have an out-of-date WMCP and could be awarded a grant. But we would not release any funds or enter into the grant agreement until that was updated. So there's a distinction there. But what the ART was reflecting on was that it wasn't acknowledged or mentioned, and so there was a concern that the application didn't address the sort of full suite, and they weren't ready to embark on this study. So it's not about whether it was approved at the time, it was just whether it was acknowledged in this application.
And Vice Chair Corn, Commissioners, if I could provide some additional information from Kim's representation. Further, I would clarify that the application review team's concern was focused on the development limitation of accessing the water from that permit. And the reason that development limitation was placed because there was an extension of time granted on that permit back in 2012. So when that time extension was final, there was a final order that triggered the need for an updated WMCP in August of 2015. And that WMCP being approved then would potentially lift that development limitation. So it's really hinged on the development limitation, its requirement to have the WMCP to be lifted. If that, it's going quite into the weeds,
But it's
but there's a
helpful.
distinction between the plan being submitted and the development limitation that's on the permit.
So or do I understand then that what was submitted recently, the update to the management plan, starts that process, and so you're moving towards the development limitation being lifted as well?
It would start a review of that process, and that's a different section of the department that
And
would...
so is there a concern in timing that that wouldn't be complete before disbursement of funds would be expected?
I would not be able to answer that.
That was not expressed to us. So again, Mr. Chair?
I would think that the review of WMCPs tends to be fairly consistent and would not be an issue had this application qualified under the review team's standpoint. But again, the issue for staff is the technical preparedness and the importance of this issue being identified in the application as part of our review, and the concern that staff had by it not being mentioned because the WMCP triggers the ability to be able to develop the rights that they were seeking the feasibility grant to study.
But functionally, the actual lifting of the development limitation is not, there's not a great deal of process ahead of us for that, if assuming that the submitted update is approved?
I'd want to be careful because I haven't looked at the permit language specifically, but my general reaction would be that assuming the WMCP submittal is up to snuff, the process of reviewing that will not take a long period of time on our part.
Great, thank you.
Any further questions? Did you have another comment?
Oh, I just thought Commission Member Quimps had his hand up earlier. Did you have a question?
I'm curious about, what are the real impacts of a delay, if not this cycle, then, the next cycle, and having all of this done in time and upfront, so.
The aquifer's dropping at a record rate, and we're kind of at everybody's guessing like everybody else. We don't know. I do know that we can't drop our wells anymore, or drop our pumps anymore. They're bottomed out where they're at now. So it would take drilling in order to get those down. And like I said, we've had to drop 2 of them in the last 2 years. So just the demand, quite honestly, for the city has gone up considerably. In the previous 10 years, we issued, prior to 2018, we issued 55 building permits. Last year alone, we issued 62, and already up to date this year, we've issued 75 and just approved another 250 house subdivisions. So I say approved. We've approved that in a way to which, if we don't have the water to build the houses or to deliver to the houses, we won't be able to build those houses. And so there's a considerable amount of a year is a long time in anybody's book, but for how fast things are growing right now, it's a very long time.
Mr. Chair, if I may, and Commission, and just to add to what Scott, he obviously understands how the system works better than I do. His previous career was as a large irrigation district manager. I would just add that the urgency is that we have a willing corporate partner, and we could very well lose that, not really the relationship, but that opportunity if we don't get moving sooner rather than later, which is the primary trigger in addition to the growth demands that we're having. We've also just done some innovative housing amendments with our code, so we're addressing multiple issues, I think, by moving this forward without compromising any technical or legal matters.
How long will this study take to complete?
The engineers have told us between 3 and 6 months is what it would probably take, but ultimately a year. We have to go through all 4 seasons to see where the levels are, and so ultimately it'd probably be a full year of feasibility before we would know.
Okay, thank you. Any further questions from commissioners? We thank you for coming and providing this information for us.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your time.
Thank you very much.
Does staff have any more comments, or do you have any more questions to staff? After one of these is rejected like this, what kind of information did you provide to the applicant to help them to maybe be successful in the next round?
Commissioner Corn, for all applicants that do not receive funding, we reshare the evaluation summary that we generally have already shared with them during the review process, and we offer the opportunity, if they would like to talk with us, to talk about their application and how it could be improved and revised and resubmitted.
Thank you. Mr. Baumgartner.
Just one more question, to make sure I understand. Are these grants in on an annual cycle, so their next opportunity is roughly a year from now?
Commissioner Baumgartner, we haven't set the specific deadline for feasibility study grants for this year, but it will be in October, the fall, and then there would be a review process, and we'd come once again in the spring. So generally, you meet either May or June, so that would be the next time where folks could receive funding, about a year from now.
Could you pull the slide up with the options before us in terms of the staff recommended and the other options, the alternatives? Thank you. This is a point of clarification, question, order. Is it better for us to have a motion and a second to discuss, or to discuss prior to making a motion?
Parliamentarily, we probably should be discussing a motion, but at this time, I think we're trying to gather information in anticipation of making a motion on the recommendations of staff. So,
You said parliamentarily, we probably should be discussing a motion?
well, if you're coming to a conclusion, a motion, but at the same time, this is a discussion and question and answer period. Director Byler, you seem like you might have something that's coming on that.
I don't know if there's a right or wrong way to do that. I think you're trying to feel your way down the path here, and I think having some discussion, the timing and sequencing is really up to you.
Certainly, if a motion's on the floor, there'll be a call for further discussion, and if you make the motion, you'd have the opportunity for that first discussion. So,
And you're recused, right? You're not...
Is there a point you wanted to make about this slide?
Oh, I just wanted to make sure that I had language, and just a reminder of the alternatives that we have.
right. Has your question been answered?
It has, thank you.
Okay.
And as recused, is Eric able to participate in the discussion, or?
Once we have a motion on the floor, he would, I think, would be exempt on that because we'd be discussing a motion, I think.
This is utilities.
Right, I was recused on the Walla Walla.
Yeah.
Oh, I see. Got it. Okay.
Just
Thank
because
you.
you're from that region doesn't recuse you. This is, only time you recuse is in potential conflicts or even perception of conflicts, which the Walla Walla,
Yes.
because of his position with tribal council and all
I
that.
misinterpreted. I thought since we bifurcated those that we approved and the other two, but now I understand.
Right.
Got it.
So when we go to vote, if we're voting both proposals together, if one up, one down, then Eric would not vote in that. If we was just considering Umatilla, then we would be in a different position where Eric would be voting. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Just want to make sure everybody's clear here where we're at. So
thanks.
I think if there's no further questions, we are open to a motion. At least originally, we was thinking would be on the Walla Walla study as well as the city of Umatilla, with one being approved and the other denied at this point in time, if the commission feels so inclined to make such a motion.
If I can
Mr. Baumgartner.
make a motion that we can have further discussion if it's warranted. How's that? I move that the commission adopt the funding recommendation contained in Table 1, Section 4 of this staff report for the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council and the City of Umatilla grant applications. This motion will result in funding of $77,715 for the Walla Walla grant application only.
Is there a second? Motion dies for lack of second.
I think we need to separate the two
Okay?
for purposes of decision. So,
Entertain a motion then first on the Walla Walla Basin.
that's what I would recommend.
So are you making that motion?
Sure, I'm happy to make a motion that the, as recommended by staff, the Walla Walla Basin funding be awarded.
Is there a second to that motion?
I second that.
It's been moved and seconded, and Commissioner Klemps is exempt on this one because he has recused himself because of potential conflict. It's been moved and seconded that we approve the Walla Walla Basin funding proposal as presented by staff. Is there any further discussion or questions on that?
Just a point of discussion, we did have people comment, we had a fair amount of discussion with the city of Umatilla. I'm presuming that there's nobody who wants to speak about the Walla Walla Watershed or Basin Watershed Council.
I had no comments from any, and I didn't ask for that again, but I don't think anybody new has come in that might be concerning that issue. Am I correct in that? Okay, if not, we have no further public comment on that as far as I know. Commissioner Baumgartner. Thank you. Any further questions or comments?
Yeah, from a comment perspective, given the scale of the grant and what I read in the comments, that there are already conversations and work toward integrating what may be considered, I think was described as potentially duplicative work. It sounded to me like that was already in the works, which is why I'm suggesting funding it.
Okay. If there's
And only in response to that, I'm pleased you saw that in the works. I did not. That's the one thing that had me worried, is whether there was an opportunity for collaboration that we were missing. I think these grants are important. We've talked about the benefits of collaboration, and I would just like to have a little more comfort that where there is a apparent opportunity for collaboration, we are encouraging that.
Is that something that staff could address?
I might weigh in a little bit on this. I want to be clear, based on my reading of the record, and I'll ask staff to correct me if I mischaracterize this, but my understanding is that the intention of the applicant is to move forward on the project as they've described it, but that I anticipate there will be a lot more conversation among the three sovereigns that I was mentioning earlier, and the process that we're initiating there, and the local groups like the Walla Walla Basin Watershed Council, where we'll be looking at the kind of the holistic issues associated with water management and trying to resolve issues for the long term in that basin. But I don't have the impression that the council is, while they intend to engage in conversation, the intent is to move forward with the project as they've described it. Is that fair?
Yes, Vice Chair Chang, Commissioners and Director, that is correct. The Watershed Council is planning to move forward as proposed, and what the evaluation review team reviewed is the application on its merits. And if you have concerns about the merit of that technical study, because of what was raised, you could choose to not fund it. But if it's just that it would be nice if it were to be done a different way, that's not the question before the commission. The question is this a study worthy of funding or not?
And remind the commission that staff found that to be adequate through their review process. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Any further discussion or questions? If not, we'll go ahead and vote the motion by roll call and by recorded commissioner. Commissioner Moe, how do you vote?
Yes.
Commissioner Karahara?
Yes.
Commissioner Baumgartner?
Yes.
And I'm Commissioner Corn, and I vote yes. We now have before us the consideration of the city of Umatilla and whether to vote for approval for funding or to vote to follow the direction of staff and request a resubmittal in a year if they feel so inclined to do so. Any further questions, or if not, we would accept a motion, whatever your pleasure would be, to move forward or to resolve this issue. And as Commissioner Quimps now is back as a voting and participatory member in this issue.
To discuss or to make a motion, or to make a
Well,
motion?
you know,
and discuss?
really, we're down to the issue, so probably a motion would be the most effective way, and then we will discuss, and then you vote your conscience, I think, would be probably the most proper way at the point we are, because we've kind of discussed the facts to all this, unless something else has come to your mind, and certainly that's open to ask staff or the director or discuss amongst ourselves.
That's good guidance. Thank you, Commissioner Corn. Good leadership. I move that the commission do fund the proposal coming from the city of Umatilla, in contrast to the recommendation of the art and the staff.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
It's been moved and seconded that we approve the funding of the Umatilla proposal. Is there any discussion?
So we've talked several times since I've been on the commission for all of a year, which is not much time at all to get into the implications of things about how grant making does cross over with policy and what we're intending to encourage. And the particularly somewhat different bar, as I'm understanding it, for this particular grant program seems to me one that implies the department is behind innovation. And the makeup of the application review team, is that what ART is, application review team? Which includes the business interests, Department of Agriculture, the fact that there are a pretty limited number of criteria that need to be satisfied to get a grant to the fund, do not fund stage, as I understand it. And the history of the kinds of projects that are being put forward, all rolled together, on one hand, and the fact that we're not getting that many applications on the other hand, which makes me think that, you know, these are people who are taking, all of the applicants are people who are on that leading edge of, hey, we've got issues, we want to solve them, here's an idea, let's be entrepreneurial about this and move forward. All of that, in my mind, implies a granting program and a relationship with the department that should be more interactive than what I'm hearing occurs in the 8-month period. I think about it relative to an OWEB grant, for example, where a grant that comes in is a complete grant, then gets a site visit. There's back and forth during a site visit. There's conversation about concerns that grant reviewers have. Maybe I'm missing something, but I don't hear as much latitude for that in this grant program. And my sense is that as that information of expectations and what's missing and what could do better is getting back to the applicant, that they're responding in ways that had they done it ahead of the date of application, this wouldn't be an issue at all. All of that in my mind makes me feel like, no, this is something where that we should learn from this and make sure that our grant program in this particular case, as you described us looking over the course of the coming year, and make adaptations. But in the meantime, it seems like it's something that all other things being equal, we would have funded. And so I would encourage that. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. I have some other thoughts, but.
Okay.
And just in response, did you?
Let's go with Bob, and then we'll go with you, because I looked that way. Sorry, Eric. You'll have plenty of time, so.
Sorry, Eric, if I jumped in on you. In response, Joe, I struggle with this one, and I think I'm going to repeat a little bit what I said earlier, but I want to make sure if I'm missing it that somebody or anybody can correct me. But my understanding is we felt this was a good project, represented as a fundable project, but it missed at least one important aspect of the procedure with the Water Conservation Management Plan. And as I said earlier, I'm loath to get out of our procedural, because I think that sets a really bad precedent and bad habit of people coming in later or second-guessing what they hear and see, and then coming in with information that gives them a competitive advantage, or potentially gives a competitive advantage. So that's one of the key things I really struggle with. The other second part of that I struggle with in this conversation is, just how important, what is the stage of the Water Conservation Management Plan? Is there something substantively that's missing in it that we really should have in front of us before we make a decision? Or is this just really a procedural thing, a minor procedural thing that we could let slip without setting a bad precedent? I don't really have the understanding of that I wish I did. And the third thing was Eric's point that I don't fully understand at this point, and that's how critical is it at this stage to fund this? Is it really within a year going to put the city at such a point that it makes this good project moot? And I just don't have as good of an understanding of those 3 points as I wish I would. So can you help me out?
Commissioner Baumgartner, you listed a number of things, so I'm going to try to address all of them kind of in one.
More eloquent than I am.
Feasibility study grants are technical studies of various sorts to determine whether to proceed with a project. And it is, given that these are public dollars, the department, the application review team, and the commission are looking to see, is it a worthy public investment to look at this project and say, yes, we should pursue it further to determine its feasibility before implementation. What the ART is looking at to make sure that public investment is a wise one is the study going to achieve its goal? Will it be, will they actually be able to implement the study as proposed? And so if a study proposal is missing details or missing steps that are necessary for achieving that goal, it calls into question whether or not the public investment is worth it. And so that's what the ART was looking at and put in its, and used in its decision to recommend that this study not be funded. And what the case that I believe that the city was trying to make was that it is a timely study, and they have done the work sort of after the fact to be technically prepared to sort of rectify the issue. So it does come down to, does the commission view that information as compelling, this new information that says, yes, the study would technically be able to be completed, and is okay with the fact that that happened after the application was submitted, when normally there's sort of a deadline of when you can provide materials so that they could all be equitably reviewed at the same time with no one applicant having an advantage over the other. Does that get to your...
It certainly helps.
Commissioner Quimps, now you have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Corn. So a few comments. First, I have, in my former career experience as a grant writer, and I know the importance of being responsive to solicitation criteria and getting grants in or proposals in on time. If I didn't, I wouldn't have had a job, nor would my supervisees have had a job. And then I'd been through this several times as a member of the Oregon Watershed Enhancement Board, and every once in a while you have these kind of issues come forward. So, you know, it's just part of our job. My question is, I thought I heard that if the, first, that the grant could be accepted without the conservation plan, and I just want to make sure that people understood that without it, they might not be as competitive. And two, that if the plan maybe needed to be approved or wasn't up to standards, the funding could be awarded, but it wouldn't be distributed until that plan was deemed acceptable. Is that correct? Or did I mishear something?
Commissioner Klemps, for both of our funding opportunities, if there's a permit that you need before you can take an action, we will not disperse funds until that permit is obtained. And in the case of water management and conservation plans, just to be internally consistent, for this funding opportunity, the commission could award funds to an entity that does not have an approved plan, but we would not enter into a grant agreement with that applicant or grantee until they had gone through that process.
And then my third point is, and this probably doesn't make it easier, but when we talk about the importance of process, which I think is really important, and it's important for equity, but then we also have this process today, and you know, we have the public review and comment, and we have people have an opportunity to make a case, and if we, you know, if this isn't a genuine step in that process, then why do we do it?
Yeah.
You know.
Good point. You're right, it doesn't necessarily make it any easier.
Well, another thing that doesn't make it any easier is, it was pointed out, we do have the funds here available, but to go against the criteria of what we set up by, not we, but the staff is set up to go through, which is really quite exhaustive and quite thorough, and because of the nature of what we're doing there, that process is being followed. Is it fair to others that we alter the criteria? I mean, really, we're kind of in the second round of doing this. We had this happen last year on the other grant cycle that we go through, that the Dog River issue. And so I think we have to be really, really careful in making exceptions to maintain the integrity of the process. Like what you were saying, the process is important, and if it was an error on the staff end, I think you admitted an error, that there was something that you said you thought was missing, but it was clarified it wasn't missing, and you accepted that. So when there is error on the staff and the process that all participants had a part in as they was going into this process, it's acknowledged, corrected, and not considered as it wasn't thrown out because of that reason. It's these other issues that you're trying to be true for the fairness of all. And in many, many times, we're dealing with a situation where we've only got limited funding, and so we have to chop it off somewhere. Today, we have the luxury of, well, there is the funds there to do it, and we'll probably be there next year for the opportunity, you know. And then I understand the urgency of the problem, but at the same time, the process is there that we have to follow, in my mind. Further comments? Kathy, did you have a comment?
Yeah, I really think the process is important. The thing that was caught was that you have a well permit that has a development limitation on it that was not mentioned. You know, that's a critical piece of information that was left out of the application. And yes, they could fix that, and they've done work to fix that, which is wonderful. But that's after the fact. It was not it was not part of the total thought process of putting together the feasibility study. And that's what the application review team caught. I think that's an important point, that we need to make sure that we capture the staff expertise in finding that, yes, this is important. We don't think you've thought through all of the stuff you need to yet. On the delay, yes, I understand that. It hurts, but it's not the end of the world. Yes, there are buildings going up, but I live in Bend, there's buildings going up all the time. And in the economic downturn, yes, it's slowed down, but it still happens. Those developers will still be there tomorrow, next year, whenever. And it might be a good idea for some folks to get it through their mind that we do not have an endless supply of water to build houses for. And I hate to say that because, yes, I'm a human, I like to drink, and I don't really want to close the door behind me. But we've got to start thinking about that, and, okay, yes, you're thinking about it, we know we need another supply, let's do all the steps we need to get that done.
Thank you. Any further questions or discussion on this matter? If not, then I think, are we prepared to vote the question? Okay, we'll go ahead and vote by roll call vote, each commissioner individually.
Motion?
Yeah, okay, the motion was that we approve the Umatilla proposal, grant proposal, feasibility grant proposal. It was properly moved and seconded, and that's what we've been debating. That's what we, a yes vote will be a vote to approve, and it will require 4 votes to pass. So if we're prepared and ready, we'll go ahead and call the roll call if there's no further questions. So Commissioner Moll,
Yes.
Commissioner Karahara,
No.
Commissioner Klimps,
No.
Commissioner Baumgartner.
Yes.
I'm Commissioner Corn. I vote no. The motion fails by a vote of 2 for, 3 against. So we encourage them to apply next year. I don't think there's any further business other than public comment, and I think we have some public comments, so thank you, Jennifer. So at this time, we'd be open for public comment. We'd like to start first with Peggy Lynch from the League of Women Voters. Is she here? Yeah, she's here. Okay. I knew you went out and in, and I did. Okay. Oh, okay. Thank you.
Peggy Lynch, League of Women Voters of Oregon, and for the new members, I just want to say really quickly a couple of things. One, welcome, I'm glad you are here. I usually try to attend Water Resources Commission meetings whenever I can. Why is the League of Women Voters involved in this? Our league members get involved in studies when they discover that there's an interesting issue. And a number of years ago, we started studying water issues for both quantity and quality. And in 2009, we actually published a sort of a primer on water, and then followed it up with, so what are the issues around water? And then more recently, a coastal studies. I was privileged enough to serve on the Integrated Water Resources Strategy initial policy advisory group, and then on the second one. So that's what brings me here today, is to share a few things. I was just at the Ways and Means Committee meeting, which is why I zipped out, because we do follow the budgets. We still have, in the natural resources area, I follow the 14 agencies. We still have the forestry and Dogami budgets to see move through the system. But we certainly testified in favor of the water resources budget, although we actually testified in favor of more money than you received, just so you know. I wanted to share really quickly that the Integrated Water Resources Strategy document, the place map, has a prominent place in Representative Jeff Reardon's office. When you walk in the door, it's there on his cabinet. And it is something that is guiding him as he is interested in doing things around the water vision. We happily supported the two policy bills that you talked about today. As a matter of fact, we really said that we would really like to see place-based planning expanded, that in fact we needed more money in more places because we are seeing such success in having all of the parties together to talk about quality and quantity together, because those are critical. I was thrilled to be able to hear the little bit of the Umatilla, simply to make a note about the 50-plus houses, the 62 houses last year, and the 50 houses plus the 250 subdivision. That's information that will help us as we talk about what kinds of water needs we have in the future, both infrastructure needs, the needs for employees to help with this situation, natural areas, all of those factors. These are the kinds of statistics that I think will help us share the story around the state. The other thing I guess I do want to share with you really quickly is that the list of legislators who are interested in discussing water and finding answers to this very great need is growing almost daily. As the legislature begins to wind down and they have less responsibilities day to day, they are coming to those of us who are in the building and saying, we want to move this conversation along. They are saying, sign me up. And it's bipartisan, bicameral, and you all have, many of you, particularly the longtime members, have worked on trying to move this discussion along. I believe the IWRS has moved us forward in a great many ways. We have slowly but surely received more and more funding, different kinds of programs. This is our time. And so in the next 2 years, I am hopeful that we will all be celebrating about this time of year, that we have accomplished something really significant for all Oregonians. And I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from the Commissioner?
I have one really quick question. Among those representatives, House and Senate, do any 2 or 3 people come to mind you see as really taking a leadership role between session in elevating the conversation and participating in perhaps the 100-year water vision?
Yes. Representative Reardon is very interested and is interested in, he's from Happy Valley, but he's very interested in bringing together a group of people. We are not sure, and Senator Roblin is on the Senate side, is making sure that there is a program during the Coastal Caucus Summit in August, so that there's a conversation there. There are some Republican members as well. I'm reluctant to provide in public a full name. Ask me after the meeting, and I'll be happy to share with those, because I don't want to commit to people who have not done so. We are hopeful that there will be a small conversation to begin this process between July and December, so that by 2020, we can begin to have more significant movement to move forward in the process. And I think that's probably the fairest way to mention this, Director Byler, right?
Thank you.
And there are, by the way, just so you know, the governor's office and agencies are also actively having this discussion and trying to figure out what is the best way to engage the public in the long run, and how do we do that in the same way, for instance, as was mentioned earlier, as the very wonderful 2017 transportation plan.
Thank you. Commissioner Fowler.
I just want to say thank you for bringing your passion for the water issues in the state and your assistance to try to seek additional funding for I think the planning, I've been talking about planning all day myself, so, but and certainly long-term needs for the department. So thank you very much for your efforts.
You're welcome. And just so that you know, we have local leagues around the state, and certainly the Rogue Valley League is an important one, as well as the Lane League. And there's a Deschutes League, and they're active in the Deschutes Basin issue. Probably the closest I have to the two other Eastern Oregon is that we do have a small league out of Hermiston. We do not have an official league over in the Vice Chair's district, unfortunately, although there are some individual members who are interested in that area. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peggy. Appreciate that. Our next commenter will be Claire Cloak, Clackamas SWCD.
It's Claire Clark, Clackamas SWCD, also reside in Corbett, Oregon. Thank you, Chair Corm and members of the board, for listening to us today. Welcome to the new members. I happen to, in my semi-retirement and also working part-time as a district employee, get around to a number of different agencies, not as many agencies as Peggy does, but I'm learning a little bit on the way. The comment that I was going to make today was I'm just awestruck about the ability to have partnerships to get things done. And I think the place-based and place-based partnerships is just another example. That's the sage-grouse in Eastern Oregon, and it gives me hope that these locally or regionally type of cooperation can break the partisan gridlock that we have at a state and national levels. It's really important in that particular area. As a course of the discussion today, the rapid groundwater drop, use of water, is the groundwater drop just due to the city, or is it due to agricultural withdrawal? I don't know the exact hydrologic factor in that particular area, but I think we can talk about that in any area of Oregon or in the country. The other thing that was saying, and Peggy brought this up, one of the things we belong to another organization called the Oregon Association of Conservation Districts. Includes all 46 SWCDs in the state, and we had a meeting last fall and sort of revitalized ourselves, and we have a fairly active young new legislative committee that has met just about every week and talked about issues, had a matrix of bills that we supported, didn't support, opposed, and water resources, of course, was right in that list with the place-based in the budgets. We talk about budgets and those types of things. So we're learning, and the other thing that we also know is that we do have the legislative session, but it's also the rulemaking sessions and the short sessions that are also a part of the equation. Anyway, that's all I have to say, and thank you for the time. Any questions?
Thank you for your time and comments. Is there any questions from members of the commission? If not, thank you very much. Our next speaker will be Tracy Rutten from the League of Oregon Cities. Welcome.
Good afternoon, Chair and members of the Commission, and I will say congratulations. Everyone butchers my name, and you got it just right. So that never happens. So well done.
Sometimes.
Thank you for the opportunity. I'm going to be very brief. I wasn't planning on making any public comment today, but I think following the discussion that you just had around the feasibility study planning, just had some thoughts I wanted to share with the Commission, if I may. We, as the League of Oregon Cities, don't take positions on individual projects. You can imagine that would get relatively complex for us pretty quickly. So we've got a lot of members out there with significant needs across the board. I work in the area of water and environment issues. The infrastructure issues are even more significant and expand beyond just water and wastewater projects. I think today's discussion and what kind of came to mind for me is highlights, I think, maybe some challenges that, or I should say opportunities, hopefully, to take a look at the process. I think that a process where you've got a pretty significant application that needs to be put together by the applicant that takes what I'm imagining is considerable time to put together and do it well, that is accepted once a year and then brought forward the following spring, 6 months later, for potential approval, is a fairly, I think, slow process. In my mind, one step missed seems that you are all of a sudden in a scenario where you're missing your window. You've got to loop back around, and I'm hopeful that the city will be able to come back in October with a revised application. But to me, it strikes me that there should be more of an iterative process where there's some opportunity for dialogue, where there's some opportunity for feedback. The notion of the WMCP, I understand that. I actually understand it really well. We've worked on that issue in a number of ways, in a number of policy areas. I did not realize, and I would like and appreciate if staff could provide some later clarification of whether approved WMCP is required. To me, it would seem that approval of a project contingent upon an approved WMCP would be appropriate. My worry in this really is because we rely on the state equally. An area that we had worked on in the last years was around WMCPs, but essentially was actually around our permits. And how do you access the undeveloped portion of a permit? Because there are requirements in Oregon now on how you can go about accessing any water you haven't used under your permit yet as municipalities. One of those requirements is a WMCP. One of them is fish persistence conditions that are placed on the permits by the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. We have permits that have not been processed for a very long time. I will say I've talked to the director about concerns with some of the permits that have been sitting there for what I would say is an inappropriate length of time. I think over a decade for some of them to be approved. They're aware of the concerns. ODFW doesn't have the staff or capacity right now to do the fish persistence conditions. It puts our municipalities in a really difficult position when we are waiting on the state. We have a lot of water problems that we need to be facing, and we need to be innovative, and we need to be flexible, and we need to be able to try and get to yes where we can. So I would say to the commission, I would suggest looking at those processes, making sure that we can be as innovative as we can. We have a lot of big problems that we need to solve. I'd also just say on the notion of challenges from the state, we have an affordable housing crisis. I know housing and development was mentioned. Right now in the legislature, they just passed a bill last night that will mandate many of our cities to do higher density housing or zoning for housing, whether we want to or not. So we're getting some mixed messages from the state of Oregon. On one hand is, you've got to develop more in city limits, it's got to be higher density, we have a crisis, and we're going to tell you exactly how you want to do it. We don't get funds actually also for that work that's going to be required of us. But then on the other hand is, we have a water problem, we have a supply issue, you've got to conserve the water, we're taking that seriously. But I see two different messages coming from the state of Oregon right now, and so I think it's something that's got to be addressed. I do think there's a nexus between water supply and housing, and I think there's got to be a discussion at some point in time to try and rectify what that policy really is and what the direction is from the state of Oregon to municipalities. And I think I'm going to cut it short because I went a lot longer than I expected I would. I appreciate the opportunity to provide comment to you. I appreciate the robust discussion that was had today, and just would encourage everyone to take a look at processes to make sure that we can be flexible and innovative going forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions?
I just want to make a comment. I think I understand your comments, and I guess a couple of points I have is the idea of being flexible in order to be fair to people. I think we need to be responsive, but if we're going to be flexible, that flexible has to be predictable. It has to be done in a way that it's shared with everybody.
Fairly.
So that it's consistent. And I've said this before, but we need information so that we can get to a good, defensible, fair decision, not just to yes. And I know you said yes when we can't.
Right.
And I agree with that, but I think it's important that we have good information so that our decisions are fair to all of the applicants, the ones that are denied, the ones that are awarded, that there, as much as possible, there's, in each cycle, we're fair to the people in the recent past that submitted under the same terms. And so I don't
Certainly.
necessarily disagree with what you say, but I think those are important things to me to kind of qualify that.
And if I may just clarify, and I agree, we don't want to see projects that aren't ready or projects that aren't good projects moving forward. That is certainly not the position that we would take. What I would say is that there are pieces of today's discussion that were surprising to me. And so I think that there needs to be some clarification about what is the process. Is an approved WMCP required? And I realize that that was for the purpose of developing the water that was in question under the project, but just the other components of that acknowledgement of the development limitation, which to me sounds like that was something that staff actually overlooked. And so I think there were components of today's discussion, I think, that were surprising to me, where I think that we do need to make sure there's a very clear process. And I think that the notion of having something iterative might help to rectify some of it before it lands in your laps.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Questions? Did you? Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, the last I have is April Snell from OWRC.
Commissioners, staff, for the record, April Snell, Executive Director with the Oregon Water Resources Congress. I will be brief because I am hungry, and I suspect that many of you are as well. I have kind of said this first part before, but I think it's a good entree, and then I will touch upon a few points and then try and wrap up in a positive way as I endeavor to do. In a perfect world, stepping back for that for a moment, I represent irrigation districts and ag water suppliers around the state, but I feel very strongly that we're all in this together. And while I can feel good about what my members do and that they provide water to farmers and others who grow food that benefits it all, when I look at the things that benefit my members when it comes to water infrastructure and water supply, the funding and the mechanisms that allow them to do what they need to do, I've not found an instance where something that benefits them is not something that benefits us all. But this idea of us as a water community is something that is a fantasy, at least at the moment. When it comes to water, we're driven by fear and by paranoia, and it's much easier for us all to go off in our respective camps and shoot down anything that anybody else suggests rather than come together and actually talk about things in a meaningful way. Yet, I think every person in this room agrees that we need to do that in some fashion. And how do we do that? Well, you guys today have struggled with just a small bit of that microcosm in the funding world, in the feasibility funding world. But in the ideal world, you guys, or the state, however that works, would have a robust funding system for planning, for collaborative, community-based efforts like what we talked about yesterday up in San Diego. There would be a robust funding source for the exploration and feasibility of the ideas that come from those types of efforts, and then you would have funding to implement those very good ideas that come out that provide benefits to the environment, the economy, and all of us who are around in it. But because of the world that we live in, you have a feasibility fund that is actually your most longest running fund that the department has since 2008, and actually has the most robust funding stream out of the three pots. The planning is a pilot, and that's not very good and doesn't have very much funding and isn't available statewide. And the implementation fund is fairly new and doesn't have a whole lot of funding in it, and is frankly is in need of a massive overhaul, which was known from the instant that the stakeholders, including myself, helped pass that bill. But we're also very cognizant that if you poke too many holes in something, then it won't work anymore and it'll go away. And I very much want to see a robust funding stream that's something that benefits us all. So how do we get from here to there? And I think Ms. Rutten hit upon some of the concerns I had regarding the conversation you guys had on the feasibility fund. That the city's not my member, but I was struck that there seemed to be some inconsistency in some of the actual statutory requirements that go around the feasibility program, and a desire to have more consistency between these different programs. But at the same time, you guys alluded to, in many of the comments you had, the need for the agency to both be consistent and equitable in how you handle these things, but also making sure that you're not stifling innovation, and that the small amount of funding that you have is going to meaningful projects. Now, what's my point to all that? You guys are going to have more of these things that come before you. I think we can be hopeful that there will be others who will, this water vision that's been discussed, we can be hopeful that there will be more formal discussions about that. Undoubtedly, there will. I'm poised to be engaged in every conversation I can that will be hopeful, but I'm also pragmatic and becoming more cynical that we've got a long ways to go before the various constituents of water are able to even talk about things, let alone agree upon something. And so as commissioners, many of these things are going to come before you to sort out, and it's not going to be easy, and I commend you for your efforts in doing that, but also recognizing that there's many things that are outside of your control. And I commend the director and his staff for trying to make the most of what you're given. So you heard earlier from Raquel on the few tiny little pops that the legislative body has decided to fund for you guys. That's pathetic. And I am really continually discouraged about how little investment is in natural resources as a whole, let alone this agency. But you guys aren't able to do anything about that. And so how do we do that? And I guess in wrapping this up, I've had some new perspective lately, and I think one of those things that comes from that is being able to take the time and abilities you have and use that as best as you can. And so regardless of what happens in these more formal efforts, as you guys know, I'm no stranger. I'll be back at future commission meetings, but I'm committed to finding other folks, whoever those are, to help me broaden this conversation, to try and break down these barriers that we have, and I'm hopeful of what we can come from that. So with that, I'm excited about what we might be able to accomplish. We have a lot of work ahead of us, but I really appreciate each of you and your efforts in being part of the conversation and helping lead where you can. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, April. Any questions?
No, I would just suggest, April, that you do your best to fight off the cynicism and keep focused on the positive.
I second that.
Thank you, April. Is there any further business or further comments that need to come before the commission today? Director Byler?
No.
Okay. If not, then we're adjourned until next time.